Hello, this is Cho of the Shiny Colors Discord. Welcome to another episode of the Shiny Review. Today we're taking a look at the final part of the Oshinoko collaboration in Enza, featuring the Twilight produced SSRs for Ruby and Kana. Now keep in mind that both of these cards are limited. Once the collaboration is over, these cards are gone. The biggest hint to this is that they do not have the Twilight pieces that you can purchase in the shop for getting duplicate Twilight supports, implying that there is no intention for these cards to be back, and thus they wouldn't put those pieces in the shop for you to get in the future. So, this is really your only opportunity to both get these cards and upgrade these cards to the max. With that all out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the first of the two cards, Ruby. Round 3 of the collaboration brings us to the finish line with a frustrating gacha format since the banners are separated, but two interesting cards to look at. Ruby is a pure vocal unit with an emphasis on AoE appeal starting as early as 1 star, while also boasting an absurd reliance on her personalized buff, Shining Eye. This acts as a form of attention up, but also triggers passive she unlocks at later stages and opens up her appeals to their plus effect. Ruby has a couple glaring problems, the first of which being the lack of synergy with other collab cards outside of Kana 1. A second one is her over-reliance on Shining Eye, which leads to a real problem when it comes to her appeals, which we'll get to soon enough. As a unit outside of b-komachi, Ruby is a very basic vocal card with kinda poor synergy, but a somewhat interesting Twilight passive to consider. I would moderately recommend pulling for this Ruby. Her roles are Attack All and Buffer. Ruby's initial skill is a vocal 3.5 that grants the Shining Eye buff, which is attention 50% up, for 2 turns. The plus appeal, which requires 2 or more Shining Eye buffs, is a vocal 1.5 appeal. Her 1-star appeal is a vocal 2.0 to all judges and grants a 50% vocal buff for 3 turns, and the Shining Eye buff for 3 turns. The plus appeal, which again requires 2 or more Shining Eye active buffs, is a vocal 5.0 appeal to a single judge. The 4-star appeal is a vocal 3.0 to all judges, grants a vocal 100% buff for 3 turns, and the plus appeal, which again requires 2 or more Shining Eye active buffs, a vocal 5.0 appeal to a single judge. Notably, her 4-star appeal does not grant the Shining Eye buff. More on that later. For her passives, at 1 star she unlocks a vocal 50% buff, which requires it to be turned to her earlier. It has a 30% chance to activate once. This comes with a vocal plus 150 uncap. Her 2-star passive is a vocal 130% up that requires 1 or more Shining Eye active buffs. This has a 20% chance to activate twice, and this comes with an all stats plus 100 uncap, except for mental. Her 3-star passive is a memory gauge 50% up if you are in the center position, and it has a 60% chance to activate once. This comes with a mental plus 200 uncap. At 4 stars, she unlocks her rainbow passive, which we'll talk about in a second, but this also comes with a vocal dance visual plus 100 uncap. Her memory appeal when maxed is a vocal 100% up for 5 turns that grants the Shining Eye buff for 5 turns. Her total uncaps are a plus 500 to vocal and a plus 200 to dance, visual, and mental. Her 4-star passive is a vocal 220% up that requires 2 or more Shining Eye active buffs, and it has a 25% chance to activate twice, limited to once per turn. Her Twilight passive is an appeal strength buff of plus 4% that increases with each turn, up to a maximum of plus 20%. Now this is something we can talk about with Ruby. Instead of following the formula as previous Twilight cards tend to do, Ruby changes things up by having her Twilight passive be the slow start ability from Grad. Now, depending on who you ask, this passive is either too late to be impactful or not important enough to consider. If Ruby had released a couple of months ago before Grad power crept slow start out of the equation for most builds in favor of an ability that is both slow start and start dash together, you could see an argument for this on at least a book or 2. I'd say to experiment with this if you like playing slower teams and can get past turn 6 in Fest somehow. Now, Twilight's collection has not gotten any less expensive, so it's kind of fair to consider that many may only have Ruby at 0 or 1 star. Ruby is in a really tricky situation given that the entire point of her kit is to prime up her 4-star passive through the use of her appeals. At bare minimum, you'd want to get at least to 2 stars, if only to access her 2nd appeal at 1 star and at least 1 passive that synergizes with her kit at 2 stars. This also allows her to at least be a part-time AoE unit that is there to set up a small amount of vocal buffs. 3-star opens her more consistent option as a center, but her memory appeal is honestly not that worth it in this explosive turn to 3-4 meta we've been in for a while. Now, there is a reason why you would want to consider using her memory appeal relatively early, but we'll get to that in a second. For the support recommendation, the easiest thing you can do with Ruby is commit to the standard fare of vocal good stuff. Part of the problem with Ruby is that she doesn't synergize with a lot of attention-based support, so you kind of just work with what you've got. I feel like I've talked these supports to death, but just know that the Antika shell is still very consistent in this day and age. Kaho is a good inclusion if you bring Straylight or Hokuda, specifically Kaho, which can work well given that Ruby kinda wants to sort of stack vocal buffs. Meguru is your Daikichi alternative, even if she can't really use the appeals that well, and Hiyori is still a generally good support from the SSR pool to help build characters. As a side note, make sure to consider at least getting Starlight Ruby once, so you can use Hazuki's Honor as a support for someone else on a team if you are deciding to build this Ruby. It will make getting Shining Eye as a buff much easier for you, and will open up some options to make Ruby herself a little more consistent. For some synergy suggestions, the first one I'd recommend is honestly Kana 1. She's the only other member of b-komachi with a vocal stat, though her kit does not actively synergize with what Ruby wants to do. The biggest thing that you can do with her, though, is utilize her interest up buffs after you've already established your Shining Eye buffs in order to get a huge damage boost on a single judge with your plus appeal. This is a great way to shoot down a judge really hard, given that with her 4-star appeal, that is a vocal 8.0 getting directed at a single judge who has had their defense lowered. That's going to do a lot regardless of the situation, and makes this a pretty interesting card to set up with. Now, an option if you want to have a vocal unit on your team is Tenka 10 from My Songs collection. Because of the relatively open space you have with Ruby, lots of teams have space to be used here. Tenka 10 gives you a strong AoE positioned unit that can play into your fast memory appeal route, and gets bonus damage for doing so. Now, as a center, Ruby earns a C-. I'm going to keep it super real with you, Ruby's memory appeal is purely here to activate her passives and nothing more. Being the only collab unit with a memory appeal that doesn't deal damage is already rough, but the fact it's purely in service of her appeals and later passives, it really comes off as kind of frustrating. You can't make the most of your strong passives as a center, despite her being built for it. Now, what I think the intention is that they want you to use her memory appeal as fast as possible, so that way you can utilize your 1-star appeal and your memory appeal to grant 2 Shining Eye buffs, to then ideally activate all of your Shining Eye related passives to use on your 4-star appeal. Remember how I mentioned that having that bonus from Kana would be very useful in that situation? That's kind of what they want you to do here. Furthermore, it means that using the Ruby support on somebody else means that you can use one of Ruby's appeals, followed by that person using the Ruby support appeal, so that way you don't have to spend your memory appeal and can have it benefit from your passives rather than your 4-star appeal, if you want to take that route. Now, 9 times out of 10, you're probably just going to use her 4-star appeal with those buffs in mind, but it does mean that her memory appeal can kind of do damage. It still has the base multipliers for being a memory appeal, but it doesn't have bonus damage attached to it, which kinda sucks. As a unit, Ruby gets a B- to a B. Ruby is a whole conundrum in how she wants to play, as we've already brought up before. She's built her passives to be a center, but the only thing her memory appeal is for is to set up her 4-star appeal and plus appeals. While it's impressive single target damage on those appeals, the AoE is kind of paltry even under those bonuses. Her anti-synergy with attention up, because Shining Eye doesn't count as attention up, limits her options as to what she can really abuse and work with, and she does virtually nothing if she doesn't play into her buffs in the first place. She's very different and kind of rewards a very different playstyle than what Shining has tried to do in the past, which is super early memory appeals into then stacking bonuses to use for the AoE appeals. Normally, you intend to use your memory appeal as a finisher, where here you're almost kind of hoping it's your opener, if anything else. She's very different, for better or worse. Next then, of course, we have Kana. The second half of the final collaboration banners is Kana, this time showing up as a dance card compared to her original vocal print. Each of her appeals focuses on how much mental she currently has, with her initial appeal being a generic buff effect until you've already taken damage, in which case you get a 40% current health reduction and a 5-turn dance buff. The dance buff improves with each new skill, and the plus condition becomes easier to work with on top of even better appeals. Kana 2 feels like an apology letter to Antika players with the way her kit is designed. I kinda hope that this is a good indicator that Antika will get cards of her level or better in the future. Each passive wants to sit in a specific health range, her appeals get her there instantly, And she can either play defensive with her 1-star appeal, reducing interest while also ignoring current interest, which allows her to play around specific teams, or she can go all in on her 4-star AoE appeal with a heavy amount of dance buffs on top of the mental reduction. She has no conflicts with other dance cards in b-komachi, and feels like a genuinely complete unit all on her own. Her roles are center, attack all, buffer, interest ignore, and self-damage, and I moderately to highly recommend pulling for this Kana. If you are somebody that is genuinely serious about playing b-komachi as your best team, Kana is the card you kinda want to build around. She absolutely has everything you want for a team, and happens to work with the most cards out of the collaboration compared to everything else. Kana's initial appeal is a dance 3.5 that grants a 30% dance buff for 3 turns. Her plus appeal, which requires your current mental to be above 99%, is a dance 50% up for 5 turns that reduces your current mental by 40%. Her 1-star appeal is a dance 5.0 that ignores the judge's interest, lowers said judge's interest by 50% for 1 turn, and applies a 50% dance buff for 3 turns. The plus appeal, which requires your current mental to be above 65%, increases your dance by 100% for 5 turns, and reduces your current mental by 40%. Her 4-star appeal is a dance 4.0 to all judges that increases your dance by 100% for 3 turns, and the plus appeal, which requires your current mental to be above 65%, is a dance 100% buff for 5 turns, and reduces your current mental by 40%. Her 1-star passive is a dance 50% up that requires it to be turned to her earlier, and it has a 30% chance to activate once, and comes with the dance plus 150 uncap. Her 2-star passive is a dance 120% up that requires it, again, to be turned to her earlier, and has a 30% chance to activate twice. Her 3-star passive is a dance 170% up that requires your current mental to be between 35% and 64%. It has a 30% chance to activate twice, and comes with a mental plus 200 uncap. At 4 stars, she unlocks her rainbow passive, which we'll get to in a moment, alongside a vocal dance visual plus 100 uncap. Her memory appeal, when maxed out, is a dance 4.5 that doubles up your dance buffs. Her total uncaps are a plus 200 to vocal, visual, and mental, and a plus 500 to dance. Kana's 4-star passive is a dance 220% up that requires your current mental to be between 35% and 64%. It has a 25% chance to activate twice and is limited to once per turn. Her Twilight passive is an appeal strength buff of plus 10% to plus 2% that decreases as the turn count increases, so the longer the fest goes, the weaker the buff is. In contrast to Ruby's slow start style Twilight passive, Ruby gets Start Dash. Much like what I said with Ruby, this passive would have had a much more noticeable conversation if this had been a few months ago, but the strength overall might not be high enough compared to other options, especially with the memory gauge options that are available now to help with consistency over just pure damage. That said, Start Dash has almost always been more useful than Slow Start on any build, so there's an easier argument for using Kana over Ruby if you're just looking for someone to make a book for you. Having a free 10% buff to your appeal strength at the beginning of your fest is honestly pretty useful, and can be interesting in some setups, but might not feel that impactful off rip. But it is something to experiment with. Now, like we said before, Twilight is expensive, so you may only have her at 0 or 1. Now, Kana, fortunately, is already activated from as early as 1 star, giving her access to both appeals, letting her manipulate her health, and take advantage of the supports she'd ideally be using. The higher you go, the more consistent you get. 2 star gives you an extremely easy to use passive, and you just shore up everything good about her kit as more copies arrive. You're comfortable to pull as many copies as you think you'll need, but you're perfectly fine sitting at 0 or 1, though I'd at least recommend getting her to 1 star if you can. If you really are committed to the bit, then go for as many as possible. For the support recommendations, the MVP, surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, is Twilight Yuika, with the second place being the Limited Nichika, alongside the standard fair Stray Light supports, alongside even, of course, Nocchill and Daikichi Kogane. Compared to another b-komachi unit we talked about earlier, one of the big advantages for Kana is she can synergize with Twilight Yuika and Limited Nichika in a huge way. Nichika operates on the exact same axis as Kana in regards to mental values, as does Yuika's 4-star passive. Stray Light continue to have good synergy for most dance teams, especially given how much Kana stacks active buffs, alongside the periodic piece of Nocchill support. Kogane isn't super mandatory, but she does have some good passives if you are building a relatively large health bar, and stalling can sometimes be useful if you are not entirely committed to the mental reduction. Using one appeal will make sure the other appeal is online, so there may not be space for Daikichi, but it's certainly worth hanging on to as a third appeal if you need to shuffle things around for some specific fest format. For the synergy suggestions, the first one I'd recommend is Memcho. Memcho doesn't actively interfere with what Kana wants to accomplish by giving you more opportunities to draw your best appeals early. She's also a good alternative center if you want to run Kana as your dance position idol in the off chance that you don't really have a dance unit you want to use. That said though, Ruby 1, while not entirely mandatory, also happens to be a solid AoE dance unit that can give you more mulligans for further deep draws. Her 4-star passive, surprisingly, is perfect for Kana's skill set. We looked at it before and thought it was just a strange inclusion as if to make her somewhat of an Antika-inspired character, when in reality, it was all a setup to make sure that it was a good passive to utilize with this Kana, so it all kind of works out overall in the end. Now, whether or not they really intended that, or just so happened to print the passive on Ruby and then said, well, we gotta make that make sense later, who knows. But, it's very nice that these all work together in the grand scheme of things. Now for the grades. As a center, I'm going to give Kana a B+ to an A-. Kana having a pure damage memory appeal is very helpful in giving you payoff for your large dance buffs. Even if she can't link appeal into more damage, a 4.5 with no strings attached that also happens to fortify your dance buffs afterwards can result in a very powerful follow-up turn if you can't quite finish things off with her memory appeal. For being a collaboration character, she feels reasonably strong for what she is, despite some scoring flaws. The main thing being, of course, that she can't link appeal, which means that she doesn't get score bonuses for that. But that may impact her in the super high grades, but I don't think it'll be that much of an issue in the lower grades. As a unit, I think Kana honestly earns an S-. Kana really just has a whole lot of everything. She synergizes with a handful of good supports, and can accomplish a lot with each of her appeals. I think there's a lot more opportunities for Kana to make an appearance in Fest going forward, even if she can't benefit from link appeals. There honestly might be a place to utilize plus appeal units to make her feel that much stronger if you go that specific route. It would have to be with a 3-member unit, but fortunately there are some of those already, and maybe you'll be able to take advantage of that. I think this card is real neat, and it's a real great way to cap off the collaboration. Now, that will do it for the video today. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. That also does it for all of the Oshinoko collaboration cards for now. Whether or not they decide to do a part 3 is completely up to them. But overall, I think that these collaboration cards are really neat and have helped create some really cool ideas within Shiny, and hopefully we get to see these cards do well even after the collaboration. Next time we'll be talking about the Twilight Chiyoko banner alongside the Twilight Luca support on the same banner. Hopefully those cards are pretty interesting. Till then, I've been Cho, thank you for watching, have a wonderful rest of your day.